Hello, this screencast on the flow of energy and matter through ecosystems has been created as part of the VCE Unit 2 biology course. It's one of the latter parts of Outcome 2. The ultimate source of all of the energy within our solar system is the sun. On our planet, we have plants that will convert that solar energy into chemical energy. And if we have a look at the very top right-hand corner, we can see that we have a strange looking thing up here, and that is the chemical diagram for glucose. The first form in which the solar energy takes on this planet is glucose. And generally this is going to be produced by green plants that photosynthesize. When they do this, they're combining carbon dioxide and water to create glucose molecules. And glucose is really the fundamental form of chemical energy that's used in all cells of any organism. The first organisms to benefit from this glucose, apart from the plants themselves, are the things that eat the plants. And things that eat plants are generally considered to be, or generally called, herbivores. Herbivore literally means plant eater, herb meaning plant, vor meaning eating. The things that then are the next stage, or the next organisms to benefit from that glucose, are the things that eat the herbivores. And things that eat herbivores are carnivores. Carni literally meaning meat, and vors meaning eater. So we start off the very bottom level with plants that capture the solar energy and turn it into the very first form of chemical energy, being glucose. That is then consumed by the herbivores, and they in turn are consumed by carnivores. These feeding relationships are represented graphically in diagrams like this. The plants are always at the very bottom, and this is because they are the basis for everything that comes afterwards. You can see that the energy is progressing from the plants to the herbivores, and then from the herbivores to the carnivores, and carnivores are predators. Ultimately, you may go through more than one level of predator before we get to what we call the apex or top predators. We can also see that being a pyramid, that we have larger quantities of plants feeding a relatively smaller number of herbivores, which feed a relatively smaller number of predators. But we will come back to this later on. The reason for this pyramidal shape is that there is a certain amount of inefficiency in the system, because food and energy and matter is lost at each stage. It's generally considered that the loss of energy at each stage is around about 90%. This means that for a given amount of sunlight coming in, and if we look at the bottom diagram to start with, we have a certain amount of sunlight coming into the system, and only some of this will be captured by the plants. They're not perfectly efficient. This is mostly because plants are incapable of covering every square centimetre of this planet, and they're also not capable of using all of the different sorts of energy that there is in the sunlight. We can see in the diagram that the layer above the plants, which in this case are called primary producers, is the primary consumers. The primary consumers are really the first level of organisms that are not making the food themselves. Producers like plants are able to make their own food. Consumers above that are unable to make it. They have to take it in their diet. They have to eat something else. Once we get above that, we can see that we have secondary and then tertiary consumers. But at every stage we can see that we're losing enormous amounts of energy. we need to think of that energy as being sugar. At every level, each one of those organisms is using sugar just to power itself, and 90% of the sugar that it's taking in is being used up. It's not being stored in its body, which they would then make it available for the next level of consumer to access it by eating that first individual. So if we look at it in the bottom picture, we have our plant being eaten by the grasshopper. The grasshopper is then eaten by the small rodent, and that actually it wouldn't be a rodent, would it? It'd be more like a shrew. But that shrew is only able to access the energy in that grasshopper that it has used or that it has not used just to get itself around. And again, that 90% of that energy that's being lost is not them getting passed on. A recent SAC question asked what was more expensive to produce, either a gram of herbivore tissue or a gram of carnivore tissue. And this particular diagram shows us, illustrates at least, which one is the correct answer. We can see that 1,000 joules of herbivore energy would cost 10,000 joules of producer energy. So it's taken in 10,000 joules of plant energy to make 1,000 joules of herbivore energy. But because, again, 90% is lost going up to the next stage, 100 joules of carnivore energy has required 1,000 joules of herbivore energy, which in turn required 10,000 joules of plant energy. So at every step we're losing enormous amounts of energy, and the higher up you go, relatively the more expensive each one of those joules becomes. Because if we were to say 100 joules of herbivore energy would actually only require 1,000 joules of producer energy. Now, what is all of that energy spent on? The most basic thing that it's spent on is just literally moving around. So the gazelle that we see in the top picture is using that energy to avoid a predator. The next large thing that the energy is spent on is growth. So small children will eat relatively large amounts of food because their body is using that food to grow and produce more cells. A very large consumer of energy within our bodies is our brains. It actually consumes around about 25% of all of the energy that our body uses up. And this is really because of the way that our nervous system works. I shan't go into it in great detail, but for an impulse to move along an axon in that direction requires charged molecules to move in or out of that cell. And in one direction, to reset everything, they have to be actively pumped out of the cell, and that requires energy. The other big use for energy within our bodies is maintaining our internal environment. So things like body temperature. Warm-blooded animals use a great deal more energy to maintain their internal environment than a cold-blooded organism, because they are having to keep it at a relatively constant state, whereas the cold-blooded organism is allowing its body to fluctuate a little bit more. Pyramids in ecosystems are really just a nice, clear graphical way of showing the interrelationship between the different feeding levels, the different trophic levels within that ecosystem. If we have a look at, right from the very beginning, we'll look at the one right on the right hand side, the ones for energy. The ones for energy are always going to be pyramidal. They're always going to have a wide base, and they're always going to narrow up to the top. For the numbers and the biomass, you're not necessarily always going to see this because of some peculiarities of the way that the different organisms function and feed. It's absolutely vital that the energy pyramid has a broader base because of that 90% of the energy that's lost at each stage, and it will tend to be narrow an awful lot faster than we see in the bottom picture. It'll always generally look a little bit more like the one at the top. I'll just circle that just to be clear. So the next step up, this second one up, is always going to be about 10% of the size of the one beneath it because of that 90% loss. When we're dealing with the biomass and the numbers, we can sometimes see that we have a narrow base. The ones at the base here are going to be slightly narrower for a couple of reasons. It doesn't always happen. Very often you will see that they have the pyramidal shape just like the energy does, but there are some examples, as we can see the bottom row rather than the top, where we have relatively smaller numbers of producers at the bottom level feeding a relatively larger quantity of primary consumers, which are the first and second level up. This is because of really the rate of reproduction. If the phytoplankton are able to reproduce fast enough to replace everything that's being eaten by the relatively larger group above them, then their population is going to be stable. If the zooplankton are eating much more phytoplankton than are being produced, then ultimately the phytoplankton's population will start to decrease, and that will cause a relative decrease in the population above as well. But if they're able to reproduce fast enough, if their birth rate is high enough, then it will be stable. The other time you might see something like this is where you have, particularly with the numbers, you may have a very large single producer sustaining a population of herbivores and carnivores above it. Generally, the example being given will be for a very large tree sustaining a population of maybe tens of thousands of small insects which get eaten by birds and then get eaten by snakes perhaps. So one very large producer will sustain a much bigger population. But in that case, you would still see a pyramid in the biomass because that very large tree is enormously heavy and massive and not nearly as big as the amount of mass that you have with the organisms that are feeding off of it. Okay, some of the nutrients that we see within an ecosystem are cycled. This means that they go round and round, changing form, but never actually ceasing to be what they are, if you get what I mean. In this case, we're looking at carbon, and the main place that we would see carbon within an ecosystem is carbon dioxide in the air. So the atmospheric carbon dioxide is one of the largest sources. Plants use carbon dioxide when they are photosynthesizing and creating that glucose that we saw in one of the earlier slides, and that stores that carbon as glucose. The glucose is then transferred to the herbivores, which are then using that carbon dioxide, or that carbon, sorry, to create their own bodies, but they're also giving off carbon dioxide while they do it. Indeed, plants give off carbon dioxide too, but they just often take in rather more than they give off. Now, when things die, they will decompose. So the decomposers, things like fungi and bacteria, will give off large quantities of carbon dioxide, or they may get stored. In the diagram that we have in front of us, we can see that some of the carbon is stored in the form of fossil fuels. We've got that black stuff down the bottom, which would be things like coal, oil and gas. Or we may also see carbon stored in the form of limestone. Limestone is a very solid form of basically chalk, and chalk is calcium carbonate. So the carbonate means that it contains carbon. So there are very large quantities of carbon stored underground in the form of chalk deposits and also in the form of fossil fuel deposits. But when those fossil fuel deposits get burnt by things like power stations or vehicles, that carbon dioxide is then released back into the environment. Most minerals have got a cycle of some sort. This one is the phosphorus cycle, but you could also draw very similar cycles for things like sulfur and magnesium, where a lot of these things are rock-based, and as the rocks get eroded by things like rain, then those minerals get released, and they will often be used by plants for the production of things like proteins. Once they get stored or used by plants, then they become available to animals and then subsequently decomposes. Some cycles, like nitrogen, may be slightly more complex than this because you're also dealing with atmospheric nitrogen and the activity of different sorts of bacteria that fix that nitrogen and make it available to plants. But generally, most of the minerals that you will see will have reasonably simple cycles. Okay, this is our last slide, and it's for the most important cycle of the lot. Water is essential to all forms of life, and there's only so much of it on the planet, and it cycles through all of the different forms constantly. We can see that this particular diagram also includes keywords from the Introduction to Ecology screencast that I made. That is, we have the biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere and lithosphere. We just remind ourselves that biosphere is all of the things that are alive. Atmosphere is the gas component of the planet. The hydrosphere is the liquid part, and the lithosphere is the rock part. We're dealing entirely with the hydrosphere when we're dealing with the water cycle. The first stage of the water cycle is powered by the sun. The sun heats the oceans, or really any large body of water, and causes some of the molecules within that body of water to gain extra energy and transform into a gas. That's called evaporation. So warm water will evaporate much better, or there will be an awful lot more evaporation from warm water than there will be from cold. That's why, say for instance, the Antarctica is a desert. It has very, very low levels of precipitation compared to an area that's next to warm water like, say, Queensland. The other way that water can get from being a liquid state up into the atmosphere is something called transpiration. And transpiration is what happens when plants give off water. When a plant opens up the little pores in its leaves to enable the carbon dioxide to come in for photosynthesis, it gives off water at the same time, and that's called transpiration. Transpiration is what enables plants to take up nutrients through their roots, but that's a different chapter, and we'll come to that in the next unit. Once that water gets up into the atmosphere, it will eventually come to an atmospheric layer where it gets very cold, and when that happens, the water will condense and form water droplets. Eventually those water droplets bump into each other and stick together, and they will gradually get heavier and heavier. At some point they're going to become so heavy that the cloud is no longer able to keep them up in the sky, and they fall out of the sky in the form of precipitation. Precipitation really means when something drops down, and the main forms of precipitation will be rain, snow, hail, and sleet. This water falling out of the sky will either collect in lakes or form rivers or soak into the ground. Either way, eventually the vast majority of that water ends up making its way back into the ocean again. This is essentially the water cycle. You don't need to know it in any greater detail than this for VCE level. This brings us to the end of this screencast. If you have any questions on it, please post it to the Google group or ask me in class. Thanks for listening.